So we know that the geopolitical sands are indeed shifting in the context of the increasing polarization and fragmentation of the global world order and this confrontation amongst major powers. And it is in this context that South Africa must now choose in this battle of ideas. Are we going to join forces and align with bad actors whose dispensations are characterized by populism, fanaticism, oppression, tyranny, closed systems? Or are we going to stand firm using our constitution as the bedrock of our ideals in continuing to stand for, defend, and promote the visions and the principles that essentially ensured South Africa's freedom, ideals like democracy, openness, tolerance, justice, the rule of law. And so it is in this context that our drift into the ambit of this axis of malign actors and our failure to speak truth to power, our failure to come out firm in terms of condemning acts of hostility, aggression, terror, and war is very confusing in light of course, the significant legal international action that South Africa has taken in respect to the current Israel-Hamas war. Now, our position, the DA, one of our, you would understand, founding principles is a respect for the rule of law. We believe the rule of law to be sacrosanct. And it is in that context that every time I have been interviewed on the matter of the ICJ, I have said that we as the Democratic Alliance respect any state party's right to approach any international organ of justice. So we respect the ANC's right to have approach to the ICJ. That said, it is somewhat curious in the context of the state of our own finances, the dwindling resources that are available by Treasury. We sat through the budget speech last week and we saw the fancy footwork Gorongwana had to sort of, the tap dance that he did around trying to find alternative income and revenue streams in a pre-election year where they can't raise taxes, and all sorts of very interesting things that were done around carbon tax additions, taxes for any foreign companies operating in South Africa, not raising income taxes, but not raising the bands either, which is essentially an additional form of taxation. So we saw some fancy footwork. And in the context of us potentially hitting a fiscal cliff if nothing changes by 2027, how it is that we afforded hundreds of millions of rands on some of the world's best silks, senior counsel advocates and international jurists to approach the ICJ over a conflict that really has very little to do with South Africa. And it's obviously in that context that you're asking the question, why did we do it? Were we motivated by moral outrage or obligation? Or was there some more sinister intent? Or was there some form of quid pro quo where essentially there was a financial mechanism, promise, undertaking, that the ANC would somehow receive funds? Now, we know, we all watched with great interest and concern when, for example, the boardroom table and the chairs were seized from Luthuli House. The NEC's glass boardroom table was seized by the sheriff because the ANC were bankrupt. Now, all of a sudden, no declarations have been forthcoming, but we're told by various NEC members that the ANC's finances are under control. We're seeing them now roll out an election strategy and campaign. And interestingly, in Parliament, nobody can seem to tell us where the money came for this litigation at the ICJ. In Parliament, there are a number of mechanisms available to us. One of those is something called parliamentary questions. I have submitted 35 parliamentary questions to the Department of Justice, to the Presidency, and to DIRCO, to Minister Naledi Pandor's office, asking all sorts of questions on funding, who funded our jurists, who funded the litigation, the travel, were there any donations made by foreign actors, organizations, NGOs? Very interesting in the context of both the president and the foreign minister having traveled twice to Qatar and to Iran late last year before the court action was launched. And so I await those responses. This Wednesday at 3 o'clock, on Wednesday the 28th of February, we'll have a verbal parliamentary questions and answer session with Minister Pandor, and a bunch of other ministers, including our State Security Minister, where we will be given an opportunity to ask further questions in this regard. Right now, I'm not going to go publicly and say that we believe that there are quid pro quos and that there are donations being made from X, Y, or Z actor. I think that information will make its way into the public space as we begin to get answers. Something that South Africans should take great comfort in is that our institutions and our oversight institutions and apparatus still work very well. We can do things like submit Promotion of Access to Information Act requests that compel state departments to disclose exactly how much money they spent on. I could ask a question such as, what did the minister eat on the flight and how much did the meal cost, and they are obliged to tell me. And our courts have consistently upheld our requests. So we are currently going down that rabbit hole, and it's going to be very interesting to see what we find out. Our position on the war between Israel and Hamas is that we, like much of the Western world, consider Hamas to be a terrorist organization. We, of course, condemn the brutal, atrocious attack on Israeli territory on the 7th of October that has, of course, resulted in hellfire being unleashed in Gaza. We condemn the killing or the injury or the collective punishment or any suggestion that there may be collective punishment of any innocent civilian. The people of Gaza have not had an opportunity to democratically elect leaders since 2007. Hamas are not a bona fide democratically elected government. We condemned very publicly Pandor's phone call to the leader of Hamas. If Pandor was genuinely interested in mediating towards peace, she would be engaging with the internationally recognized leader of the Palestinian people, which would be the Palestinian Authority via the United Nations and all sorts of existing multilateral bodies. Hamas, of course, have vowed to eradicate the state of Israel from the river to the sea. They have said that they will continue to Operation Al-Aqsa Flood. They will stage those operations over and over and over again until the state of Israel no longer exists. In that context, we have heard very concerning remarks made by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and certain ministers in his cabinet, such as Minister Eliyahu, and we have condemned any suggestion by the Israeli authorities that a two-state solution is no longer possible. The DA has mapped out very clearly in all of our statements. I have released 8 media statements to date on this, and the members of the public can go and read those on our website. We believe that Hamas must disarm. A fresh date must be set for an election to take place in Gaza. The hostages must immediately be released. The provisional measures that have been ordered by the ICJ in respect of the protection of civilians must be upheld. And it is, of course, deeply concerning to see what is unfolding within Gaza. That said, the Israeli state does have a right to defend itself. They are the last bastion of democracy in an increasingly hostile Middle East. We know that they are surrounded by a ring of fire in regards to Iran, the Houthis, Hezbollah. We know that by the European summer, our winter, that if the situation is not curtailed or contained, that there will be a regional escalation that in the context of what is going on with Russia and Ukraine could lead to significant destabilization in our global order, and that the situation must be brought under control. And ultimately, the Palestinian people have a right to self-determination, to sovereignty, to security, to live in an unoccupied manner with a credible democratically elected government, and that the only plausible pathway to peace is that this is negotiated by the Arab world. And of course, Jordan hasn't opened its borders, Egypt has not opened its borders, and it is because the region is increasingly concerned about where this conflict is going that South Africa decided to spend hundreds of millions, if not billions of rands, litigating at the ICJ in a matter that is probably going to take a decade for the court to determine is beyond me. I think that the ANC have garnered a lot of domestic support for having done so, because many South Africans are still deeply triggered by the conditions in which the Palestinian people live, that are reminiscent of the conditions in which the vast majority of our people lived under the apartheid regime. But it is my hunch or my suspicion, and I will only confirm this once I've got verifiable evidence, but it is my suspicion that our government was not motivated to take the action that they did by justice. They were not motivated by what is good and right and true and just. Rather, there were more nefarious, you could say, party political objectives. In the case with Russia, for example, we know, because of declarations that have been made, that the ANC receives significant financial resources and backing from Russian oligarchs closely connected to the Kremlin. People like Viktor Vekselberg, for example, he's a Russian oligarch that owns a significant stake in a South African mine, United Manganese. And we know that that oligarch is making donations to the ANC. I was at the Munich Security Conference when Yulia Navalnaya, that's Navalny, who was, of course, until he was, we believe, murdered by the Russian state, the leader of the opposition within Russia. I was at the Munich Security Conference when Yulia Navalnaya spoke. And within 30 minutes, most leaders of the free world had issued statements condemning Russia's role in essentially the murder of Navalny. It took our government longer than a week for, via a tweet or a remark made on X by Clayson Moniela, the foreign minister's spokesperson, to say that Pandor urges a swift investigation into the circumstances surrounding Navalny's death, of course, in an Arctic penal colony. They're not willing to speak out. And one last thing before I hand the mic back to you, Mike, what was so gut-wrenching for me, sitting, watching Yulia speak to the free world just hours after learning of her husband's murder, was that the Secretary General of the ANC, Fikile Mbalula, was at a conference with Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, in Moscow, speaking about this conference on neo-colonialism. In the moment that Navalny, the leader of the opposition in Russia, was murdered by the Russian authorities, that's certainly our belief. The schizophrenia of our foreign policy landscape under the ANC, one moment standing up for justice, going to the ICJ, calling for Israel to halt its military operations. The next, we've got the ANC's Secretary General sitting at a conference with leaders of the Kremlin while Russian dissidents and opposition leaders are being murdered in penal colonies. The schizophrenia is going to cost South Africa its most significant trade partners. And we are already starting to see signals, very stern warning signals, coming out of the United States. And I don't think that it's going to be long until Europe follows hot on the heels of what some very influential senators are doing in the United States.